Welcome to Makers and Mystics, the podcast for art-driven seekers of truth and lovers of life. I'm Stephen Roach, and I invite you to join me as we explore the intersections of creativity, faith, and the human experience. Martin, it's an honor to have you with me today on the Makers and Mystics podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. It looks like we're both hanging out in our libraries, so maybe a good question to start with is, what are you currently reading? Is there a story or a book that you're currently inspired with?
Well, what am I currently reading? I would be reading, there was an amazing an amazing writer and thinker called James Hillman, and I worked with Jim a little bit at the very end of his life, so I would be reading part 2 of his 3-part biography at the moment, which is brilliant. I would be wading my way through all sorts of Eastern Orthodox literature, which I either by myself or, to be honest, I would receive anything up to about 30 books a month from people that just send me them. So there's a whole other library that's just Orthodox mystical Christianity that has been donated to me somehow. I mean, mercifully, people don't have my home address. But if you really put your mind to it, you can find out where to send the parcels. So I'm sort of wading through that as well, and just various hardy perennials. I've been reading Moby Dick over about a year. Moby Dick has been interesting. I always describe it like a men's conference gone horribly out of control. And you're desperate for a little bit of estrogen by the time you finish that book. But that would just be a few.
Just a few to mention, yeah. Do you find that you read in a lot of different genres at one time? Does it help you to kind of go from biography to mythology, or?
I would say I'm probably what you could call an associative mythologist, which was a phrase actually that I think was coined by a friend of mine, the late Daniel Deardorff, great mythologist. Associative mythology is not quite the same thing as comparative mythology, where you're just saying, oh, can't you see that Kali is really Baba Yaga? It's not that, but it suits a modern mind to a degree, where you're reading an old myth, but you're making connections to philosophy and plays, theatre, movies, all sorts of things. And it's a kind of bricolage of influences. So I don't read a lot of novels. I don't know why. It just stopped. It just stopped when I was about 16. But I read heavily, but it tends to be, I noticed I have about, say, 5,000 books. An enormous amount of poetry. I didn't know I was accumulating it, but about a third of the library is poetry. And then you have theology, and then you have anthropology, which I'm very interested in, romanticism, and on and on and on. Yeah, so those are the areas that I swim between.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, as I mentioned to you before we started the recording, the Makers and Mystics community is primarily comprised of artists, in whether choreographers or filmmakers, poets, visual artists, musicians. And one thing I'm curious to hear from you about is how myths and storytelling impacts the artist, and what do you think that myths and some of the old stories have to offer to the artist?
Great question. And I think you come back to the power of images. Although if you're not careful, when people talk about myth, they tend to think of them a wonderful bit of literature. But of course, myths come from oral traditions, and they're filled with images. And it's often been argued, actually, that a myth is a ceremony being enacted on the tongue, and a ceremony is a myth being enacted in real time. So
I love that.
There's a million ways in which an artist can apprehend a story. For example, for the last few years. It's not running at the moment, but I put together a postgraduate MA program called Poetics of Imagination here in England, where in the morning we would explore a Siberian myth or an Irish tale or Arthurian, but then in the afternoon, rather than endlessly discussing it, you could go to a recording booth, or you could go to a sculpture studio, or you could go for a walk, or you could move into a different medium to apprehend quite what had happened in the morning. So I have a background both I was a professional drummer from about 16 to 23 or 24. Then a lot of the next decade was as a painter. So I'm reasonably cognizant in that kind of relationship, and I'm always encouraging people to try that out. That guy actually I just mentioned, I haven't thought of him a lot recently, James Hillman said an interesting thing about myth. He said myths take persuasion before they allow themselves to be told by you. You have to court them, you have to flatter them, you have to show fidelity to them. They have to know, he's very animate. You treat it like a living thing. And one of the ways, of course, you can do that is what he always called sticking to the image. So when you have a dream of a big black snake, you don't wake up and say, oh, that snake was my mother. The moment it's your mother, you've lost the snakiness of the image. Mm-hmm. Don't go to books telling you what it means if your teeth fall out in a dream. Don't do that. Stick with the primary encounter. Otherwise, very quickly, you're trafficking in theory, not encounter.
Wow.
And so the thing that I think a lot of artists are really interested in is the encounter with their work. Painting was the first thing I ever did where 6 or 7 hours could pass and I barely knew what had happened. Suddenly it's dark outside. I'd never had access to anything like that before. So one of the things I worry about actually with myth is we end up, as Joseph Campbell would say, we end up with a religion defending ourselves against a religious experience. Mm-hmm. We theorize our way very quickly. I know a lot of people who have far more knowledge of church history than they do the Gospels. Mm-hmm. It's seductive. History is a wonderful thing, but as soon as you're sort of drifting out of the encounter for me with Christ into schisms and reformations and things, that is a secondary layer for me, a secondary concern.
Yes, absolutely. It's interesting because I've thought a lot about this, because we here in the Makers and Mystics community, we talk a lot about building bridges between the arts and the faith, between the arts and the church. And one of the things that I notice is that we have a tendency in communities of faith to rush to get to the interpretation, or we have a tendency to rely heavily on logic. And that's not to diminish the value of logic, but it's to say that there are other ways of accessing information. And the artist, and more specifically the poet, is often not concerned about the interpretation, but about the poetic experience that the art form brings. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that relationship and how, some of the mythical ways of thinking, the storytelling, the artistic way of thinking, and maybe our tendency to domesticate the wildness of the stories. How do those things interact?
As you're saying this to me, you're making me think of... You must have come across Ian McGilchrist? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're making me think of Ian McGilchrist and his sort of magnum opus book, The Matter with Things, that came out a few years ago, where he's really arguing about the right and left sides of the brain, really as a huge... It's more symbolic than I think it is sort of biological, but he's really arguing that the rational... let's get everything in a line, let's think this through, is an emissary really in service to the master, which is the creative imaginative impulse. And as you know well, in most cultures worthy of the name, imagination at its furthest reaches bumps into divine ground. It bumps into things, I mean, William Blake, of course, would have known all about this. It bumps into things that the artist is dimly aware of themselves. And if you are merely executing a set of ideas that you've already had, where's the safari in that? Where is the adventure in that? You want to fall into a kind of swoon or a frustration or whatever it is. So whatever the soul is, I've learnt over the years, my soul is not convinced by much that I seem to do. I come back with these achievements and it's like, well, however, emotional duress, certain forms of pressure seem to wake this character up. Now, I'm not saying to anybody that's listening, go looking for scars. I wouldn't suggest that for a second. Life will bequeath you of that anyway. But still, the valleys as well as the high points of life are going to have a tremendous amount of information for all artists. So to go back to your original question, Rich, remind me what that was.
I was speaking about that relationship between the mythical storytelling and then the more logical sides of our brain,
Yeah, sure. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I've lectured and taught at some very highfalutin universities over the years, and you can't get through the door if you don't have a piece of paper called a PhD and the capacity to do that if needed. But one of the things I always say to my students when I'm telling a story is do not tell the story what it is too quickly. Allow yourself to be troubled. Allow there to be a pebble in your shoe. Walk with the story a while, because what happens, it's something that happens to me. I get emailed relatively frequently, less so now. People saying, we want to talk about climate emergency. We want to talk about Me Too. We want to talk about this or the other. Provide us with a story that is clearly allegorical to back up the point we want to make. Now, you're already dealing with a pamphlet, not a story. You're already dealing with a stuffed bird, not a hawk flying over a field. So all those things are very worthy things to talk and think about and need mythic consciousness in them, but you have to let the story lead. As soon as you are stretching the story on the rack of infinite progress, the story has kind of crumbled in your hands, I think. So it's an interesting thing learning a story as an oral storyteller, because I've been doing this for a while now. There's a limited amount I can do with a story until I'm in front of people telling it. There's not much use me churning it around in my head in the study, because the way oral storytelling works is there's three things at play. There's your imagination as the teller, there's the story itself, but there's also all the kind of ums, ahs and twists and turns that the audience are giving you through their eye contact and their mammal responses. And if you don't incorporate that into you learning about the story early on, you end up rather like a bad actor. You end up as you're a sort of a migrant from a local drama club, thespianing out, because actually you're not really down there with the eye contact reading what's happening in a room. And when a story really connects, you realize that good Lord, myths are not really to do with a long time ago. They're to do with a kind of eternal present that is announcing itself now. But that takes courage, and that takes a lot of experience to get to that point. I work to a disturbing degree now without handrails. So, for example, I would have toured Canada 18 months ago, 2 hours a night, all the way from Nova Scotia to Vancouver, over about 3.5 weeks, totally improvised. Decent crowds, a few hundred people a night, no microphone, so you've got to be loud enough to get to the back of the room, no technology, just one guy alone facing off 500 people. with no plan. But I wouldn't recommend that if you're new to the game. You've got to know yourself very well. You've got to be, I would suggest, sort of grizzled, and know how to hold your nerve. A lot of storytelling is just not floating out of your body with pure panic as soon as you start to talk to people. You experience it on a podcast like this. There are times where you're talking and there's a camera and there's somebody nodding, but there's some other part of you that's going, how is any of this even happening? Yeah. So anyway, that was a bit.
No, that's beautiful. One thing that I would love to hear you speak about, and it's one thing that I love about myths and storytelling, and even about the oral presentation of it, because you do get so much of the person's soul, or the interaction between, it becomes a living thing, I would say.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I love about myths and storytelling in some of the old fairy tales, I've spent a lot of time with some of the old fairy tales, and they're not tame.
No.
They're wild, sometimes brutal and bizarre, and unashamedly so. But again, drawing some comparisons, with some of the biblical stories, I find that same wildness within some of those stories, but yet we can tend to domesticate our faith. And I'm curious, how can we approach these stories in such a way as to not domesticate them, but to allow the stories to breathe on their own, as you were saying earlier?
Well, I spend a lot of my life now is concerned with this exact issue. And I think, unfortunately, part of the problem is also, ironically, one of the things that is at the very center of Christian tradition, which is a chapter and verse approach to the stories. Now, I understand, that is my holy book. I don't look at it skeptically. I don't ignore, I go to the Bible because every time I open it up, I feel I've never read it before. Every time I open the Bible, it exposes some part of me that I would far rather remain hidden. However, when you have read something over and over again, it becomes scripture, not story exactly. And if there's any slight change in translation, if you've ever had a Bible you're very attached to and you read another translation, you can get quite upset because the sentences aren't processing in the way that you've invested in. And so recently I would have been telling some of my favorite stories. I've been telling the story of, Joseph of the beautiful coat going off into the underworld of Egypt, because that's an underworld fairy tale in a way. And I have to warn the audience at the beginning. I say, you must understand that the bones of this story will be accurate to the biblical telling. But in terms of the language I'm going to use, hold on, because we're going out to where the buses don't park. I have to give my imagination that license. I pray before I do it. I give it away, to God. I say, please, anything you got to add, or, please do. But that's one of the things that I am finding is there's a kind of tension in the room. In the beginning was the Word. You know what happens when people read from the Bible. Part of its power is its formality and how old and ancient it is and how far it has traveled. But sometimes tradition can atrophy innovation. And I think Christianity, ironically, to be a Christian, requires on the one half you have to be quite steadfast about certain things, but on the other, you have to be open to the notion that the Holy Spirit goes where he will, and anything can happen. I grew up around the charismatic movement, and that was high drama in 1983. I'm telling you, you saw some stuff. This wasn't the Anglican Church. This was... I don't know what it was, actually, 40 years later, but I'm sort of glad I saw it. So in my life as a storyteller, as a mythographer, and as a Christian, I'm always living in the tension of tradition and innovation, always.
Yes. It makes me think, that really is the gift of the artist, is to represent some of the stories that maybe we've gotten too familiar with. And this past season on the podcast, we've been focused on the topic of reclaiming wonder. And I think a lot of what you're saying really speaks to that for me, of even you're taking a story a familiar story such as Joseph, but then being able to add the gift of the storyteller and the gift of the imagination. And as you were talking about at the beginning, the images that really form so much of the stories, would you say that is one of the gifts that you as a storyteller, and one of the gifts that artists can bring to reawakening wonder, is re-envisioning stories that have become too familiar to us?
Yes. I was looking at a painting today. I knew nothing about the painting, and I knew nothing about what it was meant to be about or anything. It was two people walking down a road at dusk, and next to them is a figure that is not painted as clearly as they are. And it was only when I saw that the painting was called Emmaus.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And tears came to my eyes, because it was just beautiful. I mean, that's such a powerful story. It's almost unbearably powerful. But that's the kind of thing a painter can do, an artist can do, a songwriter can do. It's very important. You don't need to tell the whole of the story. Most of us, the point of a story is rarely its end. It's rarely its end. It is these, as I've said many times before, it's the acupuncture points within the story that speak particularly to you at that moment. And that is when your labor begins. You don't have to worry about telling the entire thing, but focus in on a moment or an image. As I said before, don't tell it what it is. And it starts peculiarly, and I know this sounds poetic, but it's a reality. It starts to mirror something back to you. And then you've got a painting, or you've got a poem, or you've got a sculpture, or you've got a piece of music, or you've got a bit of storytelling. For example, I allow myself with Bible stories. I'm not trying to wade from the beginning of the Old Testament to the end of the New. I choose a rather, maybe some people, if they were being uncharitable, would call it anarchic. I would call it led by spirit. But I find myself moving around, and when, just like you said a few minutes ago, especially, I mean, Jesus, how Jesus, of all people, has been domesticated. That is an act of devilment so clever, so corrupted, so fundamentally wrong, it just beggars belief. Let's look at the facts. Born a fugitive, dies an outlaw, fucking comes back, just trickster incarnate.
Yes.
On the one hand, has endless personal interactions with everybody he meets or heals, but on the other hand, there's no doubt about it, turns everybody's world upside down. This is someone that spent their whole adult life studying myths, gods, deities. I've written 17 books on that subject. Yeah. There is he's this odd crow man that comes down and drinks the darkness of the world in the most phenomenal act of love, and I can't recover from that.
Yes.
I can't recover from it. When he sort of announced himself to me, I was about to become 50. To be honest, for about a year, if I was teaching, I had to be very careful to talk at length about what was happening to me, because the sheer derailment of emotion was so talk about getting past theory. I'd have to go out onto a bench and sob, and I didn't even know why I was sobbing. As I've said before, it's like I think having an encounter with Jesus, if you even tried the audacity of doing even part of what he tells us to do, surely it would lead to a kind of protracted nervous breakdown. Really.
Yeah.
He rummages, I am the corrupted temple filled with moneylenders. I am the corrupted temple filled with goats and the rest of it. And he's walking around, kicking the tables over, lifting up lanterns. And I live in the trouble of his spiritual audit.
Oh my gosh. That's so good, my friend. Wow. You brought up something that I am excited to talk with you about, and this is totally off my notes and off the cuff, but I don't know why I didn't think about sharing this with you before. But I have been really fascinated with seeing Jesus as a trickster character. And I have been very interested in the mischief of God. And anybody that knows me or that has heard me talk, they know that it doesn't take long before I start talking about the mischief of God and how I have found some of this trickster sensibility within stories like the Emmaus Road account. When you mentioned that earlier, if that's not the mischief of God, I don't know what is. And, the countless other stories that I could recount, but as I've been studying, the trickster, and I know there are many iterations of that, but one of my my favorite scriptures is when it said Jesus appeared to them in a different form. And I think, a lot of, even with the myths and the storytellings and what did Jacob say in the story, God is in this place and I didn't know it. It's like he tends to show up where we least expect him, and I find that to be very characteristic of the trickster figure in myth. But I would be curious to know for you, have you ever thought in those terms before of Jesus as trickster, or what does that make you think?
Yes, I just wrote about it actually. I have a Substack called House of Beasts and Vines, and I wrote about it a few weeks ago, and I've never received such a mixed response. Because actually it was the time of the recent US elections, and people, I think the reaction to Trump getting in for a second time wasn't in a way quite as virulent as the first. There was almost a kind of heavy sign like, well, here we are. And actually a lot of people don't have a lot of gas in the tank for the opposition either. So, here we are. But I was arguing the case. I was saying, in some sort of, I don't want to get too political about it, but for me, in some macabre way, Trump is sort of interesting, but I don't think he is in service to holy things. I just don't. And so I then argued the case. I said, but if you're really, so in other words, a trickster in a myth or a story is someone that is a little chaotic, but is ultimately through their bobbing and weaving, is in service to a sacred end. That's what you find. I don't see the sacred end politically anywhere in anybody, any of them. But I then began to think about Jesus, and I begin to think about Jesus with the woman at the well. Think about this. At this point in time, Jesus' own disciples are very confused. I mean, have you ever tried to get a straight answer out of Jesus Christ? So he says, right, they go off to get the food. I mean, you know this story better than I do. And who would be, up pops this, or waiting maybe, is the Samaritan woman. So if you look at the Samaritan woman, number one, although the Samaritans and the Jews are not at war with each other, they're definitely not talking. Number two, you don't talk to a woman in general, let alone a Samaritan woman. Number three, this is a woman the Samaritans aren't talking to. This is what you call a triple threat. Rabbi, move on. Don't get involved with this woman. Right. And of course, Jesus juts out his chin, over he goes, and decides of anybody in the world he is going to announce himself to for the first time, it is this woman who in Orthodoxy we call the illumined one. We call her the illumined one. So that is a very strange, quixotic, beautiful thing to do. And it means that Jesus can't really be drawn with a straight line. You're always going to get people on the left saying, can't you see he's a kind of socialist? You'll always people on the right arguing the other case. But actually, a lot of people really want Jesus to be John the Baptist or Francis of Assisi, in my world.
Yes.
In my world. That's kind of what they're into. It's the return to the desert, or it's, you know, here I am petting a fawn, and there's other bits of Jesus, you know, I'm bringing a sword, you know, who is my mother anyway, you know, that sends all the Mary people crazy, you know, he's in movement, you know. Yes. So in other words, I think you're onto something for sure. The mischief.
Yes. Well, that's beautiful. I've never had the opportunity to share that with anyone else, because usually when I bring it up in conversation, they're like, "Wait a minute, what?"
Yeah.
You know, it's an interesting thing. But I'm also fascinated with artists like Marcel Duchamp and the ready-mades, and you know, just how that turned the art world on its head. And I find comparisons in some ways between the ready-made art and the person of Jesus. But you know, I think through all that we're saying, one thing that comes to mind, and there's a phrase that I think I read this possibly on your website, but it was the phrase "wedded to the wild." And I just loved that phrase when I read it, and I just started your book, Courting the Wild Twin, right now. I haven't gotten too far into it yet, so I can't really speak from it. But when I read about this book and how it was really about the exiled parts of our own selves, of course, that brought to mind the trickster character, but also the artist and the temperament of the artist, and some of my own journeys through life. But could you talk to me a few minutes about what it means to be wedded to the wild, and maybe how that plays into the book Courting the Wild Twin?
Yeah. Just to finish the end of the last thought, and then I will go to that, or just show me the book and I'll remember. Do you know the word bricoleur or bricolage?
Bricolage, yes.
Yeah, bricolage. So Christ is a bricoleur, I think, in the sense that and it's because you were talking about, you know, Duchamp and modern art and stuff like that. I always get told off in church because I spend more time looking at Cy Twombly paintings than I do icons. People are like, "You're going to hell." I'm not so convinced, you know. I've got a soft spot for the abstract expressionists.
Yes.
Anyway, but the bricoleur is somebody that walks into a room. And again, it's this tradition and innovation thing. It's this eros in one hand, rigor in the other. And they take things that shouldn't work together, and somehow they bang together and magic is made. And the artists that I like do that. And I think that Jesus is a bricoleur. He does it constantly. I was thinking I burst out laughing because I was imagining how terrifying it would have been walking down the street with Jesus, because as a parent, if you've ever had a child that's a toddler, they keep wandering off. You can't control them. And I suddenly have an image of like toddler Jesus just wandering around, you know, hanging out with the tax collectors, talking to prostitutes, talking to people in highfalutin business, hanging out with the lepers. Kind of, you can't, he's uncontainable. Yeats calls him the uncontainable mystery. The uncontainable mystery has arrived. So that's how I feel about that. Courting the Wild Twin. Okay, so that book, I did write it a while back now. So, and it's one of the last books. It was interesting. It was the first book I wrote where Christians started to write to me saying, "Do you know you're kind of writing Christian books?" Wow. Although you would deny this. You know, and I thought, I don't know what you're talking about. But of course, when I look at it now, I see the landlord's hand in every page, you know, in my own undeveloped way. So the idea in fairy tales is that on the night you were born, you had this twin that no one's told you about, and they were thrown into exile. And you grow, and you're a nice, polite girl or a nice, polite boy, and you want to get on and be affirmed by society at large. But out in the woods is this other figure that has not received all the lucky breaks that you did, has probably grown scales, maybe has grown hostile towards you. And the idea is somehow you have a residual memory of this twin. And it is the business of art. It's the business of developing what James Joyce calls aesthetic arrest. By finding out the things that you love and are going to show fidelity to, bit by bit, you court your twin back out of the forest. But the key is, you do it with beauty, You don't do it with a cage. You do it with music, you do it with art. And so in Courting the Wild Twin, I give two stories, one called Tatterhood, one called The Lindworm, one with a woman front and centre, one with a man front and centre. These are old fairy tales, which has this in it. Now, if I was to write the book now, in 2025, I would be arguing that we've exiled our wild god.
Mm-hmm.
It's God that we've exiled in the forest. But in actual fact, of course, you and I both know, in the end, it's us we've exiled. In us, we are heading to an existential crack-up when we've done it. But we've done it through what we think are the most sophisticated and enlightened of reasons. Although I don't know what your life is like and the conversations you're having. There seems to be a shift in the air in the last couple of years. There's a shift in the air that in my own years, I've never quite seen before. On over here in England, one of our kind of patron saints of culture is the musician Nick Cave. Everybody
love Nick Cave.
Falls,
Yes.
Saw him the other day in real time, actually. He was very huggy. Isn't that weird? Slim, jolly, huggy.
Yes.
Not a vampire. He's
That's
not.
right.
I've come here to tell you, he's not a vampire. Teetotal, Bible in hand. But so in other words, you've got people of the credibility of Nick Cave or the writer Tom Holland that's written a very important book called Dominion, and they go to church and they have mystical experiences. And it's not as if they are chapter and verse signed up to everything. It's not as if they have clipped their wingspan, but they're, like Jacob, wrestling with their own angel. And people are really thirsty for that conversation.
Yes.
So it's a very interesting moment for us all to be in, and very creative for us as artists.
Yes, very much so. And I have felt and seen that shift that you're talking about as well. And it's really interesting because I do believe that the artist has a vital role to play in that whole process of courting the wild god, maybe is a way to say it, and also of really coming back in touch with some of those exiled parts of our own hearts, and I think that one of the things that really enables that to happen is the very thing we've talked about in this whole conversation, and that is allowing space for the stories to exist without demanding the interpretation. There are certain things about our own lives that we can't possibly understand right now, but to know that faith is actually a space where we can wrestle through those things. And I think that's one of the misconceptions that the artist and also storytellers like yourself can help give a different perspective on, is that faith is not a place where you come when you've arrived at the answers, but that it's a context where we can wrestle through all of the unresolved places in our own life and experience. And that's one thing that you have done in my life, as well as Nick Cave and many others, is just giving space to wrestle with the questions and to rewild, if we want to say it that way, to rewild some of the domesticated parts of my own faith journey that needed to find wonder again.
I'm thrilled to hear that.
Mm-hmm. Well, one question as we get close to the end here, and it's a very practical question, but what advice would you give to artists who want to infuse more of a mythic sensibility in the things that they're making?
Well, I'll sort of speak in a circle, although I will try and be practical at the same time. One of the things is the kind of question, well, where do myths come from? An idea early in my books was that the earth thinks in myth. The earth itself thinks in myth. So this would be very much coming out of indigenous culture. The idea that if you really want to make art that has myth in it, it's less about studying Titian and all these kind of rather literary or Goya. It's more to do with going walkabout. It's more to do with sleeping by a river for 3 days and nights. It's more to do with noticing the plants that are growing up in your backyard. It's more to do with, what in the living world what is the story the living world is trying to tell you, and how is it trying to do it? Now, that sounds a bit obtuse, but if you just allow yourself to go. So, for example, I lived alone in a tent for 4 years. So to wrestle with this question, I had no screens, I had no phone, computer, nothing. I just went. It was the end of the last century. You could still do things like that back then. Wasn't a father yet. And where I lived, I had something called a brooding spot. And the brooding spot, I'd figured out that in myths, dawn and dusk are very important moments. A lot happens in stories at dawn or dusk. So I decided to sit out early in the morning and at the end of the day, and for an hour, I would just, breathe, pray, but predominantly pay attention, just pay attention to what was around me at that moment. And that is when the story of the little copse began to reveal itself to me. I also saw, by sitting in wild places, that the word wild itself is not always about kind of crazy interpretive dance. Wild has repetition in it. Animals will take the same journey to the waterhole over and over again because they know it's safe. There is all sorts of decorum. This is a nice phrase, it's never occurred to me before. There is an etiquette of the wild. You should write that down. Etiquette of the wild that you're not going to get when you're just looking through a window at it. Someone described, I just mentioned him, Yeats. They said W.B. Yeats was a man who was always looking through windows and sighing deeply. Now, I like Yeats very much, but I sort of know what they mean. It's not quite the same thing as being out there in the havoc of a thunderstorm. So in this conversation about the wild and the undomestic, spend some time in wild and undomestic places. If you're an artist and you're sick of your technique, change hands. That's what I would do with my pen. Just draw with your left hand for a bit. Surprise yourself. Decide you're going to do a drawing that 6 weeks, it's going to last for 6 weeks, not 6 hours, or you've got to go on and you keep erasing and begin. You have to keep challenging and surprising yourself somehow. Otherwise, as C.S. Lewis says, you will keep going through the back of the wardrobe, and one day it's just the back of the wardrobe. It's just the back of the wardrobe. So the job of the artist, even though your essential creative concerns will probably be with you most of your life, it's embarrassing really. I'm interested in about 4 things, and I just go round and round and round those 4 things. And I think, for the good of the sanity of people that like what I do, I'll try at least be creative in the way I go around it. But Cézanne, who my mum's a painter, my mum loves Cézanne. Cézanne painted the same mountain over and over again. Robert Motherwell painted these sort of black shapes round and round over and over again. Cy Twombly did something similar. Joseph Beuys was connected to certain things over. There's a dignity in repetition, providing you don't lose your Jobian eye. You know what God does to Job? He opens the eye up, almost terrifyingly. He says, look, buddy, this is what I have to get up to first thing in the morning. Job can't speak at the end of that. Well, the artist is the one with the Jobian eye. William Blake always says that Jesus is the imagination. William Blake says you can't be a Christian and not be an artist, because your eye, the way you behold the world, is going to change once that spirit is coming through you.
I love it. So good. Thank you for sharing that. That's amazing. As you're talking about the etiquette of the wild, it makes me think that there is a real element of discipline to wildness that we don't often think about.
Yes. In my very first book, called A Branch from the Lightning Tree, which was back in about 2009, the first iteration of it. I wrote one sentence that's probably a sentence that gets repeated back to me more than anything else. Wildness is the dance partner of discipline. Wildness is the dance partner of discipline. And I know lots and lots of wonderful, shaggy, wild people who cannot get their lives together. They cannot get their lives together because, in the language of Courting the Wild Twin, they've sent their accountant into exile. They've sent, because it's not,
Wow.
as an artist, you're not meant to know how to value your own work. But of course, you know, mythically, we contain lots of different influxes, and sometimes it's important to be sober. I knew, one of the wildest people I ever knew was an American poet called Robert Bly. But when I became a father, Bly said to me, one of the things you need to accommodate in your life now is a certain undignified lack of excitement. I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, it's not that you can't roll out the wolfskin rug and howl one night a month, but you can't do it every night. And you have to be a dad that's going to be so regular with your kids. When it's time for them to leave, it's easy for them to leave. Wow. Because you're boring. They love you, but you're a resolved figure for them. Your dad, you know. And the great mercy of my life was to receive that information when my child was young. So I knew I was always going to be at the school gates. I was never going to be late. I was going to do that. I was just going to do that stuff. Bly said, I'm thinking about him, it's good to know who your elders are. You know, Bly, I remember Bly said, he said once to me, he said, I've lived 50% of the creative life I wanted to, but the 50% I sacrificed has made me a much more of a real human being. And so I think we have to accommodate that, and the sheer ordinariness can be very, very beautiful.
Wow. Man, that speaks deeply to me as a father and as someone who's pursued the arts my whole life. I traveled. I too have a background in percussion, and I traveled playing world music for a number of years.
Amazing.
And so reconciling art and family and reconciling our archetypal selves with our ordinary everyday selves has been a bit of my life journey of figuring it. And I love Robert Bly. I've read several of his works, but that's amazing to hear that. Yeah. Well, do you have time for one last question before we end here? You know, one thing I'd love to hear you speak about. I've often used this phrase regarding the artist and regarding our community, that we are the border walkers. And I didn't grow up in a Christian context. That's church language and church culture was something that I learned at a later period in my life. You know, I grew up in a much different environment. And I've always considered myself a border walker. Many times I feel more comfortable outside of faith context than inside of faith context. And maybe that's part of that exiled person we were talking about earlier. But I know that for you, in your life, you've dealt with a lot of pagan mythology. You've dealt with a lot of myths and storytelling that exists outside the realm of Christianity. And I'm just curious to know, have you encountered a renewed perspective on some of the old stories and myths prior to where you are currently in your spiritual journey? And, you know, what can you speak into for those artists that find themselves at the borderlands, those artists that have a deep-rooted faith, but also find themselves feeling a bit discontent solely in the faith context, if that makes sense?
Yeah. First thing I would say to all of us is this, because people don't say this enough. God loves an outlaw. God loves an outlaw. You're probably doing good work. And it is painful, actually, if you are effectively an outlier. I'm an outlier. I've been one my whole life. I couldn't possibly be a storyteller if I wasn't someone that lived on the margins to a degree. And the myths that I told my journey with Christianity, 95% of them I can still tell. There's a few of them actually that I've quietly put down because actually if you're ever actually in a room with me and I start to tell stories, stuff happens. It happens. Therefore, if I'm telling a story that is really hinged on Scandinavian black magic, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm not giving, that is a ceremony that is not going to crawl into this world through my jaw. I'm not doing it. However, as Augustine says, all truth is God's truth. And so a lot of these stories have within them extraordinarily holy moments of wisdom and information and affirmation and blessing. And so the vast majority of them for me are what I would call sacred stories, and they feel terrific to tell. And actually I'm leading a course at the moment, quite groundbreaking I think, called The Skin Boat and the Star. And The Skin Boat and the Star is an investigation of what I just call Christian mythopoetics. So what does happen when you take a Russian fairy tale and put it next to the story of Ruth and Naomi? What happens when you take the Voyage of Brendan and put it next to a Siberian folktale? So I've been sort of watching that happen. I think I'm very aware in my own life I am a man in motion at this point. I'm only 3 years deep into the experience, although my father is a preacher, my brother is a pastor, so I grew up in the petri dish of Christianity. But I would encourage all of us, as I say, it's a mistake, I think. It's a mistake to become a cookie cutter Christian, where you're continually worried about fitting in rather than what God is actually trying to announce specifically through you. We live in a culture where you're told you can be anything you want to be, Nike, you can just do it, all of that kind of thing. But mythologies always say, no, you're meant to be something quite specific. In the language of the evangelicals, God has a plan for you. Well, I do actually believe that. And whether you call that a daimon in myth or whether you call it an angel in the Christian tradition, one way or another, the circumstances of your life, the wild twin of your life, is trying to push you into what the Irish would call the right kind of trouble, believe it or not. Trouble not as a negative, but trouble as a rather exhilarating voyage into, as I've said a few times already, the process of becoming a true human being. I've just finished a book for Penguin, which is really, that's the question in 30 years for me now of exploring myths, a few different cultures, wilderness rites of passage, and now Christianity. All of it is pointing towards the deepest expression of actually growing into being a real human being. And I think I probably needed 50 years of prep before I really took on the great teacher,
Yes.
So I just send encouragement to us all. And I know that there's a discomfort in being at the edge and not always feeling fully welcomed by the community. But just so you know, in ancient Greece, the god of the storytellers is Hermes, and the only way you can give libation to Hermes is at a crossroads or an edge place. It is a well understood tradition, both in Christianity, I would say, but also outside in the wider mythos.
Beautiful. Well, Martin, thank you for taking this time to chat with me today on the Makers and Mystics podcast. I'm a fan of your work. Our whole community are fans of your work, and I hope we get to connect again in the future.
Yes, just before I forget, I'm coming to North Carolina.
Is that right?
Okay, yeah, there's a band called the Swell Season. They're a folk duo.
Yeah.
And they're touring in July into August. And I'm doing quite a bit of their East Coast tour. I'll open for them. So we're making our way from, they will have been on the road for a bit before me, but I will join them in Detroit, Toronto, then down all the way through, New York, Rhode Island, the Carolinas, and finally Georgia. So have a look at some point, and who knows, maybe I'll be in your area.
I'll look it up. Thank you for joining us today on Makers and Mystics. Be sure to subscribe and share the podcast with your friends. We'll see you again soon, and until then, keep creating. The world needs your art.